Well, hello, it is September 23rd, and I'm here joined with former Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley, who is the president and CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan. Thank you so much for having a conversation today, Brian.
Great to be with you, Senator.
Well, the topic today is in regard to a recent Michigan Supreme Court decision that deals with minimum wage and paid sick leave. This is a big decision. It's going to impact a lot of Michiganders. Small businesses are not excluded from that. I would argue that they're going to be a huge component of this. I've been pretty public of my opposition to what these new policies are going to be. We can get into kind of the nuts and bolts of how it's going to work out practically. I did introduce two bills, Senate bills, 991 and 992, basically just keeping the status quo. I think our laws, in my opinion, are working. So I would say, let's just keep those on the books. So after this decision, you said, if I could just read a direct quote, there is zero doubt among the small business owners we represent at SBAM that these new mandates will have an absolutely devastating effect, reducing planned growth, forcing layoffs, and possibly even causing many to close their doors for good. So now that we're several weeks past this decision, do you still stand by those statements? And if so, kind of where are you at?
I sure do. In fact, the more that we've learned about this, the worse it gets, and you hear from more and more small business owners about the impacts of it. And the impacts are vast, and it's frustrating, I think, for many business owners because this happened through a court decision, and it happened years later, and it was so partisan in the way that it happened. There was a citizens initiative that was put before the legislature and adopted back in 2018, and that action was taken to moderate the impact on employers, especially small businesses, back then. And then that's the system that we've been under ever since. And what happened in the meantime was that the procedure that was used, the Attorney General had signed off on. There was no reason to think that the Supreme Court would have any problem with it. But what happened was that we got a new Attorney General that really hasn't been favorable toward business at all, and then also some changes on the Supreme Court. And so what happened was there was a legal challenge years after the fact in the Supreme Court, not because anything with the law changed, but because the people in those positions changed. And it created an environment where the Supreme Court essentially disallowed a procedural action that was taken back in a vote that was taken back in 2018. And it's really put us into this scenario now where there's a lot of uncertainty and concern about the impacts. And those impacts affect literally every single business that has one or more employee. Okay, and you might be looking at this, I don't know, does this affect me or not? I promise you that if you have one or more employee, it could be part-time, it could be seasonal. It doesn't matter what the status of that employment or employee is. One or more employee means that this does apply to you. And I'm actually confident that of the hundreds of thousands of small businesses that operate in Michigan and that right now, that there's not a single one that is naturally compliant with this law. This law is so unusual and so draconian and difficult to comply with that nobody would naturally operate like this. It doesn't work for small businesses, and actually it harms many employees in the way that it's implemented. It needs to be changed, and I fear that there will be huge negative impacts if it's not done before it takes effect on February 21st.
Yeah, maybe we break it out into the two different chunks because it's two different acts. The minimum wage part of it's probably a lot easier to understand. Maybe we talk about that one first. So just last week at the Capitol, there was a rally, a Save My Tips rally. They're really focused in on the tipped credit that, I think the biggest industry that affects is the restaurant workers. Could you talk about what's going on with the tip credit, what that is, and why the restaurant workers are so up in arms about it?
Yeah, this is a great example of one where the workers will likely fare worse. The workers will be hurt by the changes that are happening, even though they present it as though restaurant workers will be getting a raise. Restaurant workers themselves are saying, no, that is not what's going to happen. When you make this change, it's really going to put restaurant workers. It'll phase it into where they're under the regular minimum wage system. And so the way it works today is you have a minimum wage, happens to be 10.33. Whatever the minimum wage, 10.33 an hour, $10.33 an hour. Whatever the minimum wage is, the tipped wage is 38% of that, and then bartenders and servers at restaurants or restaurant workers make tips. Now let's say hypothetically it's a really slow shift, and not enough tips come in to make up the difference between the tipped wage and minimum wage. That restaurant absolutely has to, under every single circumstance, make up the difference for employees. But what the employees are saying is that's not necessary because their tips make it so that they make far, far more than minimum wage. And so the reason that you have hundreds of workers that are coming to the Capitol saying, save my tips, is they're saying, I don't want to be under the regular minimum wage system. I want the current system where the sky's the limit on what I can make. And so what this law that will start phasing in February will do is it will start phasing out the tipped system and put all of those restaurant workers under the regular minimum wage system. And I think rightfully so, they are very concerned that that is going to lower their income. And imagine too, here's the other thing too, like now for the small business, most restaurants are small businesses. And for the small businesses that are running restaurants, today when they're attracting workers, there's a natural shift premium for those who work like weekend evenings, like that sort of thing. So if you were to create a scenario, so in other words, you work a Friday night at a restaurant or a bar or something like that, you're going to make a lot more money than if you worked Monday afternoon. And so there's those less desirable shifts, weekend evenings, are also the ones where the workers can make the most money. It's a system that really works. And so if once you take them out of the tip system and put them in the regular minimum wage system, who's going to want to work nights and weekends at that point? It's the same wage either way. And so I think that there really is going to be a staffing crisis that comes out of this. So not only will workers get hurt and make less money, but also consumers will get hurt, less service and less options because you just can't staff up on the weekends. And then for the restaurant owners themselves, their most profitable times are the ones that keep them open for the rest of the week are the times when they're not going to be able to get staffed up. So you could see a lot of restaurants going out of business. And in fact, in other places like Washington, D.C., where this type of policy went into effect, you saw so many small businesses, restaurants go out of business because of it.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, who's going to want to work and really hustle and work 6 tables when they're going to get paid the same working 2 tables? I mean, it's just, it's really not a fair system at all. It doesn't reward working hard. And this is really it's not very often you see a policy that there's not any winners. Usually there's somebody who comes out ahead, but both the worker, the customer, and the employer in this situation all seem to come out behind. So nobody's really asking for this. The other part of the minimum wage deals with increasing the minimum wage over a 3-year period. Could you maybe talk, because there was actually some clarity that came from the Supreme Court last week. Could you talk about what that looks like a little bit and how that could impact the Michigan economy as well?
The Supreme Court had their original decision didn't say exactly what the new schedule for minimum wage increases were going to be, but it said that you have to apply inflation, but it was worded very awkwardly. It was difficult to understand what they were talking about. So the Whitmer administration had asked for clarification. They essentially asked a question of the Supreme Court. Hey, here's five different ways that we think you could interpret your decision. Way number one is the way that we're going to interpret it unless you tell us any different. And the Supreme Court came back and said, Yeah, that you're thinking of the right way. That's what we meant. So I will say it was one of the more kind of awkwardly written Supreme Court decisions I have ever read. So I certainly don't blame the Whitmer administration for saying, "What did you mean by that?" But
It can be
anyway,
really difficult to calculate when you're dealing with inflation adjustments over time. It really depends when you start and where your timing matters big time. So it can be really confusing.
it
So
really does. Yeah, it really does. And so it came out to where there was an original kind of increasing schedule, and what the Supreme Court said was take that schedule that would have gone into effect starting in 2019, started in 2025, but adjust all the numbers by inflation. So it's almost a 25% adjustment over time. So the original one said $10, so it'll be 1248. So February 21st of next year, unless an intervening action is taken by the legislature, the minimum wage will go from 1033 where it is today up to 1248. And at the same time, that tipped credit, remember I said the tip credit was 38% of whatever the minimum wage is, that'll go up to 40% of whatever the minimum wage is. So you can see how restaurants will have a double whammy. The the
mhm.
the rate goes up from 38% to 48%, and the minimum wage goes from 1033 up to
Yeah,
1248. It will ratchet up to just under $15 an hour over the course of the next 3 to 4 years, and then and then at that point it'll go up by CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, the top line or headline inflation number every year, and it'll happen on January 1st. So whereas this first increase in minimum wage will be February 21st, that had to do with the number of weeks since the Supreme Court decision. But after that, minimum wage will go up on January 1st of every year. So those rates were published. It'll start at 1248. It'll ratchet up until it gets to 1497 in 2029, and then and then adjusted by inflation each year thereafter.
yeah. So if that wasn't clear enough, the paid sick leave is relatively way more complicated than the minimum wage. Um, and there's some big changes in there, and we're definitely not going to be able to cover all of them. But I thought maybe you could highlight some of the bigger things. Uh, the current law has what we would call a small business exemption. It's modeled after what we saw in Obamacare. If you have less than 50 employees, the law doesn't apply to them. But this new law, it doesn't have that exemption. So could you maybe talk about that small business exemption, why this matters to everybody, and I guess what's SBAM's position on that?
Yeah, we were very disappointed that it's going back to a system that makes no provision whatsoever for small business exemptions. It has a slightly lesser requirement in the accruals for very, very small businesses, but everybody with one or more employee must comply with this. And they define employee as broad as you could possibly define it, which is if you are required to collect and remit income taxes on an employee, they're in. Doesn't matter if they're seasonal, part-time, full-time, whatever. If you're required to collect and remit federal income taxes, you must start accruing this benefit. And so, as you had mentioned, with between the Affordable Care Act and the Family Medical Leave, that there's a lot of precedent for saying for these employment mandates, if you have 50 or fewer employees, you're exempt. That's how Michigan law reads today. There is a paid sick leave requirement in the law today. It's 40 hours a week, but it only applies if you have 50 or more employees. And so what happens is does away with that. It says, okay, everybody's under this system. You have to provide, every business with one or more employee has to provide 72 hours of sick leave a year. And the only difference is they say if you have 1 to 9 employees, 40 of those 72 have to be paid and the other 32 can be unpaid. If you have 10 or more employees, all 72 hours have to be paid. Now, that's something you might look at that and say, okay, that's, so they're going to put this requirement in place. And so a person watching this who as an employer might think, well, but I already provide paid time off. And if I already provide paid time off and it's say you provide 80 hours per year, then 2 weeks, then that's more than 72 hours. I'm good, right? And the answer is no, you're probably not. So because first is you have to keep very detailed accruals every single pay period, how many hours that are worked and what the accrued benefit is. So for every 30 hours work, you have to accrue 1 hour of paid sick leave for employers with 10 or more employees. And then it's 1 hour for every 40 hours worked for 1 to 9 employees. So this kind, you start figuring, okay, well, man, that's like a new thing. You got to start accruals. I got to start knowing exactly when my employees start and exactly when they end each day. I got to take flexibility on when they are and aren't working away. You have to be very detailed, meticulous. You have to have 3 years worth of records. If you don't have the records and there's a dispute, the presumption in the law is that the employer is in the wrong. You must have these records. And so that means you must require employees to in a very detailed fashion report exactly when they are and aren't working. This is going to be a big adjustment from just post-pandemic. There's so much freedom for employees in terms of when they're on and off as long as the work gets done. That will be curtailed. So let's get back to this question, though, about this general leave bank. Like, what if I offer 2 weeks? Doesn't that count toward this? And the answer is it only counts if you allow that leave to be used under the exact same circumstances. Well, guess what? Paid sick leave, the law prohibits in paid sick leave an employer from requiring any notice or documentation or approval unless you get past 3 consecutive days gone. No notice, no documentation, no approval. And so unless you allow your vacation time or your paid time off to be used under those conditions, no approval, no notice, okay, no pre-scheduling, all that kind of stuff, then you can't count that toward this requirement. And that's where I think employees are going to get really hurt, is that this creates a scenario where employers are going to have to subtract from the general leave that can be used for vacation or sick time or personal time or whatever an employee needs and dedicate it specifically toward the sick leave requirement. And so, again, another detriment to employees under this law that they say was supposed to help employees.
It almost takes away the employees' ability to negotiate their own leave policies to some degree. So if they were going to have some more generic leave policy that could be used for paid time off or sick leave, and they just get more of it, they're not going to have that flexibility anymore. They're going to have a pot of sick leave. Another big issue that I'd kind of like to get your thoughts on is the problem of no-call, no-shows. I know a lot of small businesses, if you only have 1 or 2 or 5 employees, if 1 or 2 of them aren't showing up regularly, how does that play into here? How is that going to affect operations as an employer standpoint, but also from a customer standpoint? If you go to a small business, small retail shop or a restaurant or you name it, a local hardware store, you're expecting someone to be there to answer some questions for you that where can I find this size of nail or screw or something like that. If there's no one there, it's going to impact you. So could you kind of talk about what is the deal with no call, no show, and how's that going to impact people?
This has to do with the prohibition against requiring any sort of explanation for absences until you get past 3 consecutive days. So not 3 cumulative days, 3 consecutive days. So remember, 72 hours of paid sick leave is 9 days. So let's talk about it in terms of days. Say you have an employee that just doesn't show up for 3 days, doesn't call you, doesn't say anything, just shows up on the 4th day. As long as they show up on the 4th day and say sick leave, the employer cannot do anything about it. You cannot take any adverse action or corrective action whatsoever. It's only after 3 days, you can't take any kind of corrective action necessarily, but you can at least say, hey, what happened? Show me documentation for why you had to miss and why you couldn't tell me ahead of time. Now, what about absent? So that what that does is it creates a 3-day no call, no show allowance, but it's actually worse than that because it's 3 consecutive days. If somebody had 9 days built up, accrued 9 days, they could be gone for 3 days. Then they show up for 1, and then they could be gone for another 3 days. Remember, it's 3 consecutive days. It has to exceed 3 consecutive days before an employer can even say what's up. So, and then they could be back for another day and then gone for another 3 days. Remember, 9 days a year. So you could do this 3 different times where you could be no call, no show, and the employer couldn't do anything about it. But then there's another issue with this as well. So the 3-day no call, no show is one thing, but it's also chronic lateness. I think a lot of employers are very concerned about not being able to manage chronic late situations. So if a person can use increments as small as, 15 minutes or less, let's say somebody is chronically a half an hour late for work. Well, 72 hours a year, somebody could be late 140 half an hour late 144 times a year.
Wow.
And there's never a point where that was 3 consecutive days of absences. So the employer could not, under any circumstances, require that employee to do anything to justify, to show, to explain. You just have to allow it and also pay them for the half an hour that they were late. That's how this law works. So chronic lateness, so just if you got appointments, you got to open up on time. And now we know, Senator, that most employees will not abuse this law, but the thing is, some will. And imagine the morale problems it would cause in a business where you have 1 or 2 employees that are abusing it, that are chronically late, and others have to make up the difference. And the owner of the business can't do anything about it. They would literally be prohibited in the law from taking any adverse action. They call it retaliation in the law. So if anybody gets punished for any reason in a business after next February, when this goes into effect, if anybody has any corrective action taken whatsoever, what the law says, if they had taken paid sick leave in the 90 days before that, any time in the 90 days before that, the law makes a presumption that the business only took the corrective action as retaliation because they used a sick leave. So
Wow.
let's talk about some of the things that have happened. Somebody could have stole money from the till. Somebody could have gotten in an argument with an employee, with the customer. Somebody could have gotten in a fight with another employee. Somebody could, all these things could have happened. If a business took action to correct, discipline, or terminate somebody's employment, and they ever used paid sick leave in the last 90 days, the law starts with a presumption that the business must have been retaliating because they used paid sick leave. And it's a rebuttable presumption, which means that the business will have the opportunity to prove its innocence. But the way that this is explicitly written is that you are guilty until proven innocent. And that type of presumption is so damaging to just the operating environment of small businesses being able to keep active. So this provision with no call, no show up to 3 days, chronic lateness, and the inability to take any corrective action is very difficult. And let me cover one more thing, because somebody might watch this and say, yeah, but I saw that that an employee must give notice as soon as it's feasible that they're going to be absent. Yes, the law says as soon as it's feasible, the employee must give notice to the employer. But unless it's more than 3 days, the employer is prohibited from requiring any information about the absence. And so what that means is that the determination of feasible is solely up to the discretion of the employee.
Yeah.
So there is no feasibility standard, really. I mean, there technically is one, but it is one that is solely at the discretion of the employee.
Yeah.
And then one other thing too, that just kind of covering the things I think are most problematic in this, is that in terms of like when you can use sick leave, you can use it anytime up to 3 days for any reason, and the employer can't even ask, why or what's going on. But but even if somebody wanted to follow the rules, it has all these reasons that you can use it, and then for yourself or your family, but then it defines family very broadly. And it says anybody who is a blood relative or is like a relative to the employee. And what that means is that the limitation on who you can use the sick leave to support is every single person on planet Earth. There is nobody that an employee can designate anybody as like family. That's what it says. Either family or somebody that the employee says is like family is sick or needs help with something, then they can use this paid sick leave to that. All of these things kind of piled up together. You can see where it's like even those businesses, and we surveyed our members recently. We asked them, hey, how many of you offer paid time off already? And it's not a surprise, the vast majority did. It was kind of the exception to the rule to find one that didn't. So this is like a new law that, like, in terms of the benefit to employees, is not that much more than what they're getting, but it's going to make it so much more difficult to operate, so much more difficult for employees to have flexibility, and so much more difficult for customers to be well served under this circumstance. Just like what we were talking about with the elimination of the tipped wage in the credit system, it doesn't work out for anybody. It's literally across the board. Bad for anybody. Actually, one exception, it works out for those that are chronically late and don't want to have any kind of accountability because of it. I guess it works out for them. But there's not they're really overall for employees, employers, or customers. This doesn't work for any of them.
Yeah, and as you kind of lay out all those issues, I think of when we're looking at employment law, there's a balance. There's a balance between the workers' rights, and there's a balance between the employers' rights. And in the legislature, you're trying to find that proper balance where you can have an orderly society. And what we have here is just that scales are completely tipped toward workers that, and to your point there, the workers that don't want to do a good job and you don't want to show up. Those are the ones that are going to be the most protected. The workers that show up, want to negotiate with their employer and have specific leave policies. They're the ones who, ironically, are going to be in a worse position here. Is there any other major issues you wanted to talk about before we kind of wrap it up?
Yeah, let me cover another scenario where I think some of the best employees are going to come off or come out the worst on this whole thing, and that is so imagine like a business trying to operate, maintain certain hours. They have appointments that have to be kept. The train's got to run on time. And so what'll happen over time is those who are struggling with unreliable employees are going to have a buffer. They're going to have to hire more people. You can't let the unreliable employees go as long as they don't take more than the allowance of that this law gives them. So you'd have to just add more people to make up for that inefficiency that this law requires to occur. And so for those that are studious and working hard, like the amount of like money and generosity left over for them is less. See, this increases the cost in order to fund inefficiency. That's really on a macro level. That's what happens here, is that the cost of doing business goes up, not to support hardworking employees. As we already covered, paid leave is something that businesses already, by and large, mostly doing. It's kind of the exception to the rule when you find one that doesn't. But but when it ends up happening, it gets more expensive. So that just means it means that those studious, hardworking employees that are already in the system today, there's not, for their benefit and pay increases and and leave benefits beyond 72 hours, like there's just less of that to go around.
Hmm.
And so that's where I think on a macro level, what happens over time, aside from just the economy in Michigan being more constrained and growth moving other places, and some businesses going out of business, is that for those great workers, there'll be just less available to support them
Yeah.
financially,
Yeah.
benefits, time off, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, and I think for myself personally, I feel like I have a duty to be more vocal about the benefits of free enterprise and free market systems. I think the premise behind all of these new policies is a kind of a socialist ideology that there's this tension between the worker and the employer's trying to exploit the worker. And Tommy Brand, a former state rep, he owned a restaurant for 50 years. I love the guy, and he had a line that there's nothing more compassionate that someone can do than create a job. I mean, you think of the risks when he was 19. He, I don't even know where he got the money. I don't know if he took out a loan or if he borrowed money from his dad. I don't know what he did, but he took a giant risk to start a business, and he had relationships with those that worked for him in order to, he took that risk. He wanted to be successful, but he also paid them for their value. And there's a beauty in that relationship and in how a free market can actually harness and foster a good relationship between a worker and employee. And I think we got to get back to that message because um, this type of new policy is reflecting of the socialist ideology, and I'm totally opposed to it, and I think it's going to have negative consequences because who's going to want to take that risk? Who's going to want to start that next business in the state of Michigan if they have all this red tape and all this cost that they go through just to get their business going? So I guess on that, any final thoughts before we wrap it up, Brian?
Yeah, this one size fits all approach, I think, also works more against small businesses as compared to big businesses. Big businesses tend to have very standardized things where the idea of government regulate, they've got lawyers and they got budget and compliance teams, but like the idea of having a one size fits all, they might not like it, but it doesn't have the same impact as a small business. Small businesses tend to, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, have leaned into flexibility as a competitive advantage in attracting great employees. And so every time one of these employer mandates comes out, it hurts smaller businesses who really are using flexibility as their competitive advantage. And this says you can't be flexible anymore. You got to do everything in these exact precise ways. And 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 so what's going to be left over for small businesses? That's why I think it's more why it's important for our economy overall that this gets changed and fixed. But it's most important in terms of employers. It's the smaller the employer, the more important it is that this gets fixed and changed, because those smaller employers are the ones that really, the owner of the business is wearing a lot of hats, and it's not just this regulation, but it's that this one is piled on top of 100 other ones that they have to deal with all the time. That cumulative impact is very, very stifling, and you can hear it if you talk to somebody who owns a business right now, whether it's the U.S. Department of Labor or the SEC with some of their new rules, with Treasury and their new, like, there's so many things that are coming at them right now that they just need to be able to operate their businesses, and to do so in a way that is sustainable for the future, and that will benefit really everybody. It benefits our communities, it benefits workers, certainly benefits the small businesses. I think that this is one of the most impactful things that our state could do right now, is to fix this Supreme Court decision that just came down.
Well, thank you so much, former Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley, CEO and President of SBAM. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. You are a wealth of knowledge. Super appreciate your time. So just, thank you. God bless. And, we'll keep up the fight in Lansing.
Thanks, Senator. Great to be with you today.